He was just a boy with nothing, an orphan mocked for clinging to a worthless $5 coin his grandfather left behind. Relatives sneered, classmates laughed. Even strangers told him to sell it for candy money. But what no one knew was that the faded coin carried a secret buried for over a century, one that experts would one day declare worth millions. How did a boy once dismissed as foolish end up holding a piece of history that should never have survived? And what legacy did his grandfather truly leave behind? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The church was too large for the number of mourners who had gathered. Rows of polished oak pews stretched forward in solemn silence, but only a handful of people occupied them. The stained glass windows cast fractured colors across the floor, their brightness at odds with the weight of the day. 13-year-old Eli Turner sat in the front row, his thin frame dwarfed by the high-back bench, his hands clutching a small wooden box as though it were the only thing keeping him anchored. The box had been placed in his arms that morning, handed to him by the pastor after the burial, with a quiet explanation that his grandfather had left it for him. Eli stared at the box as the minister's words drifted through the air. He heard phrases about faith, legacy, and rest, but they felt hollow. The only legacy he could touch was in his lap. It was worn smooth at the corners, its brass hinges dull with age. It was not heavy, but it carried a weight that bent his shoulders forward. For the boy who had no parents and now no grandfather, it was all he had left. The whispers in the back pews were louder than the prayers. Aunts and cousins who had barely spoken to his grandfather in years commented openly about what he must have left behind. Some expected land. Others imagined old bonds or a hidden savings account. They looked at Eli with eyes that measured value, not grief. When one of them noticed the box, the disappointment was immediate. "That's it," a relative muttered too loudly, shaking her head. Figures. Laughter, muffled and cruel, followed the words. Eli lowered his gaze, his cheeks warming with shame he did not understand. The pastor closed the service with a benediction, but no one lingered long. The mourners drifted away into the autumn air, their footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, their conversations already turned to errands and dinners waiting at home. Eli remained in the pew long after the others had left, staring at the carved grooves in the wood that outlined a simple pattern. His grandfather's hands must have touched this box countless times. It smelled faintly of cedar, the scent of the old man's workshop where tools had hung neatly on the walls and shavings would curled on the floor. When Eli finally stood, the church seemed larger, emptier, almost foreign. He walked slowly toward the door, the box pressed against his chest. Outside, the wind carried a bite of late October, and the sky was a dull gray that threatened rain. The foster care worker who had been assigned to him waited near the steps, holding papers and a clipboard. She spoke gently, but Eli barely heard her words. He nodded when required, his eyes fixed on the box. She guided him to the waiting car, its engine running, ready to take him to a house that was not his. As the car pulled away from the church, Eli turned in his seat for one last look at the cemetery on the hill. The fresh mound of earth stood out against the older stones, the flowers already wilting in the cold air. His chest tightened, not only from grief but from the realization that there was no one left who belonged solely to him. The wooden box dug into his ribs as the seatbelt pressed it closer. He did not know yet what it contained beyond the coin he had glimpsed inside, but he knew with certainty it was more than the others believed. He traced the outline of the box with his fingers, memorizing each groove, each imperfection. Whatever it held was now his alone. He was too young to fully understand the burden of inheritance, yet old enough to recognize that this object was not meant to be cast aside. As the car emerged on the main road, Eli leaned his head against a window, the town passing in blurred images of shops, gas stations, and entire houses. He held the box tighter, as though the memory of his grandfather was contained within it. In a way, it was the last bridge between the boy he had been and the uncertain years ahead. The voices of mockery and dismissal from that morning still echoed in his mind, but he clung to the thought that his grandfather had chosen him for a reason. Whatever secret rested in the small wooden box was not for the others to understand. It was his to protect, his to uncover, and perhaps one day his to prove. The reception after the funeral was held in the basement of the church, a space with low ceilings and fluorescent lights that hummed faintly above the folding tables. Plates of casserole and store-bought cookies lined the counters, untouched by most. People milled about in small groups, speaking in hushed tones that occasionally rose into bursts of laughter too sharp for the somber occasion. Eli sat alone at the end of one of the tables, the wooden box on his lap, his fingers tracing its edges while the voices around him swirled like wind against the window. Aunt Marjorie was the first to notice. She leaned over, her perfume heavy and cloying, and tapped the box with her long fingernail. "So, that's what your grandfather left you?" she asked, her tone bright, but edged with curiosity. "Not much of an inheritance, is it?" Her words carried across the room, drawing the attention of others who drifted closer, their eyes narrowing with interest. Eli hesitated, unsure whether to open it, but the weight of their stares left him little choice. Slowly, he lifted the lid and revealed the contents. The coin lay at the bottom, nestled in the bare wood without padding or cloth, as though its presence alone was enough to justify its place. It was gold, yes, but dull by time, its once sharp edges smoothed by countless hands. The faded engraving caught the light weakly, offering only hints of the eagle and stars that had once been proud symbols of a nation's currency. Eli picked it up carefully, holding it between his thumb and forefinger, his small hand trembling under the scrutiny of so many eyes. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the hum of the lights and the clatter of a dish someone dropped in the kitchen. Then came the laughter. A cousin smirked, shaking his head. "That's it? A single coin?" Another chimed in louder. "You'd think after all those years, the old man would leave something worth keeping. That's pocket change." Someone else added, "Probably not even real gold. Looks fake to me." Their chuckles spread, low at first, then growing as more joined in. Eli's face flushed, but he didn't put the coin back in the box. He kept staring at it, trying to see what they could not. The coin was heavy for its size, heavier than any spare change he had ever held. He wanted to believe there was something important about it, that his grandfather had not chosen carelessly. But the mockery pressed down on him, stripping away the fragile dignity he had felt when the pastor first handed him the box. Uncle Roy leaned closer, squinting at the coin with a dismissive snort. "Worth maybe $5, if that. You'd do better trading it in for lunch money." He reached out as if to take it, but Eli quickly pulled his hand back, clutching the coin against his chest. A murmur ran through the group at his reaction, surprise, irritation, and amusement all at once. "Protective, isn't he?" someone whispered, and the laughter returned, sharper this time. The foster worker stepped into the room, sensing the tension, but said nothing. She hovered near the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes darting between Eli and the cluster of relatives. They turned away soon enough, losing interest once it was clear there was nothing more to gain. Plates were filled with food, conversations shifted back to weather and work, and Eli was left at the table, alone again. He looked down at the coin in his hand, turning it slowly in the dim light. The edges glimmered faintly, not with brilliance, but with the quiet persistence of something that had endured. He could still hear the voices mocking him, their words clinging like burrs to his thoughts. Yet beneath the sting of humiliation, something else began to form. His grandfather had left him this coin, not them. Whatever its worth, it had been placed in his care deliberately. That realization sparked a faint warmth in the hollow left by loss. He placed the coin back in the box, closing the lid firmly. The laughter from across the room rose again, but this time he didn't look up. He pressed the box against his chest, steadying his breath. To everyone else, it was worthless. To him, it was the last piece of his grandfather's hand still reaching across time. He resolved, quietly but firmly, that he would not let it go. The foster home smelled faintly of laundry detergent and something fried that had long since cooled. Eli stood in the narrow hallway, clutching the wooden box against his chest as the woman assigned to him rattled off introductions. The couple who had agreed to take him and nodded politely. Their smiles practiced but thin, and their 2 children peered at him from the stairwell with the kind of curiosity reserved for stray animals. Eli mumbled a thank you, his eyes fixed on the scuffed floorboards, waiting for the moment he could retreat to the small room they said would be his. It was upstairs, barely wide enough for a bed and a dresser, with walls painted a dull beige that seemed determined to erase any trace of personality. A single window overlooked the neighbor's fence, and the radiator in the corner ticked with the uneven rhythm of something long neglected. Eli set his box down on the dresser carefully, as though placing it on an altar. The weight of the coin inside pulled at him even when it wasn't in his hands. He lay on the bed that first night, staring at the cracked ceiling, the wooden box beside his pillow. Sleep came late, broken by dreams of his grandfather's voice, the smell of sawdust in the workshop, and the hollow sound of dirt falling on a coffin lid. School resumed quickly, and with it the routine of being a quiet boy in the back of the classroom. His clothes were secondhand, donated through the system, and the other children noticed. Whispers followed him to the hallways. The orphan, they called him, as if the word itself were a flaw. He carried the box in his backpack every day, not because it was practical, but because he could not stand the thought of it being left behind. When the backpack grew too heavy, he slipped the coin into his pocket instead, his fingers brushing against its ridged edge whenever the loneliness threatened to crush him. In the foster house, he learned to keep to himself. The other children were territorial, and the foster parents were too tired to intervene beyond reminders to finish dinner or complete homework. Eli ate what he was given, sat where he was told, and spoke only when necessary. At night, when the house had settled into sleep, he would open a box and hold the coin up to the faint light sneaking through the blinds. It glowed weakly, its faded engravings almost unreadable, but it was enough. It was proof that someone once thought he mattered. There were times when the foster mother noticed him staring at it and shook her head. "You'll need to let go of old things, Eli," she said once, folding laundry at the kitchen table. "It's just a coin. You can't live in the past." He nodded because it was easier than explaining, but he felt a quiet anger stir. To her, it was just metal. To him, it was the last thread of family he had. He began to create small rituals around it. Before school, he slipped it into his pocket and tapped it 3 times, as if that could shield him from the day's cruelty. Before bed, he returned it to the box and whispered a few words meant only for his grandfather, words that never seemed enough but kept the silence at bay. It was not wealth, not security, but it was something. Days blurred into weeks, each marked by the same routines. The indifference of classmates, the watchful stares of foster siblings, the paperwork and signatures that kept him in place. Yet through it all, the coin remained constant, its quiet presence reminding him that even if the world saw him as a boy with nothing, he still carried something no one else did. It was not simply about value. It was about belonging, and in that small circle of metal, Eli found the strength to endure. The classroom buzzed with an energy that only came on days when lessons were replaced with something different, something lighter. Posters of explorers and multiplication charts hung crookedly on the walls, but all eyes were on the long table at the front where students had begun setting their chosen objects. It was Bring Something Special Day, a yearly tradition meant to let each child share a piece of their life, something that told a story. Eli sat at his desk near the window, the small wooden box heavy in his backpack. He had debated all morning whether to take it out, whether to risk the weight of eyes and whispers that always seemed to follow him. The teacher, a tall man with thinning hair and a voice that carried more enthusiasm than the students usually returned, clapped his hands. "All right, who's first?" Hands shot into the air, and soon the parade began. A girl in the front row carried a violin case, proud as she described lessons she had been taking since she was 5. A boy brought his father's firefighter helmet, the glossy red surface catching the light and drawing admiration. Another produced a signed baseball, and yet another held up a tablet filled with photographs of last summer's trip to Italy. Applause followed each presentation, sometimes polite, sometimes genuine. Eli's turn came later, when most of the table was already full. His palms were damp as he walked to front, the wooden box tucked under his arm. He placed it down carefully, the hinges creaking as he opened it to reveal the single coin. The room grew quiet, but not the kind of quiet born from awe. The coin rested in the box, its surface worn, its shine dulled. Eli picked it up, holding it up for everyone to see. "This," he said softly, his voice catching, "belonged to my grandfather. It's a $5 gold coin. He left it for me." The silence broke into a ripple of laughter. A boy in the back leaned forward, smirking. "That's it? A coin." Another snickered. "Looks like something from a gumball machine." The word spread quickly, bouncing around the room, until even those who hadn't seen the coin closely joined in. "Rusty trinket," someone shouted, and the phrase stuck, repeated with the glee of children who had found a new target. Eli's ears burned, but he didn't lower the coin. He turned it in his fingers, feeling the weight that none of them could understand. The teacher tried to intervene with a weak smile. "Every object has meaning, class. Let's remember to be respectful." But the laughter lingered, muffled giggles that refused to die down. He placed the coin back in the box, closing it firmly before returning to his desk. The next student rushed forward with a glossy scrapbook of sports photos, and the room's attention shifted as quickly as it had turned on him. Still, Eli felt the sting. He kept the box on his lap for the rest of the day, running his fingers over its surface, ignoring the whispers that floated around him like gnats. When the final bell rang, he left the classroom quickly, his backpack heavier than usual, though it carried nothing more than it had that morning. Outside, the autumn air felt sharp in his lungs. He walked home with his head low, but his grip on the box was unyielding. The laughter still echoed in his mind, the word trinket sharper than it had any right to be. Yet beneath the embarrassment, another feeling stirred, a quiet, stubborn conviction. They saw something worthless, but his grandfather had not. The coin's worth was not measured in their mockery. It was measured in memory, in connection, in the knowledge that it had been placed in his hands for a reason. He reached the foster home, slipping past the noise of the television and the distracted chatter of the other children, retreating to the small room that was his. There, with the door closed, he opened the box again. The coin lay still, unbothered by the cruelty of classmates, shining faintly in the fading light. Eli whispered a promise to the silence. He would never let it go, not for their laughter, not for their scorn. One day, he told himself, the truth about the coin would speak louder than their jeers. The night after Bring Something Special Day, Eli sat alone in his small room, the hum of the radiator filling the silence. The laughter of his classmates still clung to him, replaying in sharp fragments every time he closed his eyes. He tried to shut it out by focusing on the wooden box resting on his lap. He had opened and closed it 100 times since the funeral, running his fingers over the smooth edges, the coin inside glinting faintly under the weak lamplight. Tonight, though, something felt different. He slid the coin out and noticed, for the first time, a thin seam along the bottom panel of the box. Curious, he pressed his thumb against the edge until it would gave slightly. A small compartment shifted open with a faint click, releasing a scent of old paper and cedar. Inside, folded tightly and yellowed with age, was a letter. His heart stilled as he pulled it out, the paper delicate beneath his fingertips. The handwriting on the outside was unmistakable, his grandfather's uneven script, shaky from years of arthritis, but still determined, still steady enough to spell his name, Eli. He unfolded it carefully, afraid the brittle paper might tear. The words sprawled across the page, written in ink that had faded to brown. He read slowly, his lips moving silently over each word, as though speaking them might summon the man who had written them. "My boy," it began, "if you are holding this, then my time has already passed. I could not leave you much, not the kind of things others think matter. What I could leave you is this coin. It may look small, worn, even worthless to most. But you must trust me when I tell you it was meant to outlast all of us." Eli blinked, reading the sentence again. Meant to outlast all of us. His breath caught in his throat. The words carried weight, heavier than the coin itself, as though they were not just a message, but a secret. He read on, his eyes racing across the page. "Your great-great-grandfather once worked at the mint. He handled metals, dyes, and designs most never knew existed. Some coins slipped through the cracks of history, marked differently, carrying stories in their engraving. This one found its way to me, and now it finds its way to you. Others may laugh, and they will. They will tell you it is worth nothing. Let them. You must remember, Eli, that value is not always what people see. Sometimes it is what they refuse to see." The room seemed to shrink around him as the meaning settled in. His grandfather had known this would happen. The mockery, the dismissals, the doubt. He had written this letter as though speaking across time, preparing him for a fight Eli didn't even understand yet. He read the closing lines with a tightening throat. You are more than what people say you are. This coin is more than what it appears to be. Guard it well, and one day, when you are ready, its truth will show itself. Until then, hold on to it, as you hold on to the memory of me. Love, always, Grandpa. Eli folded the letter back carefully, his hands trembling. He slid it into the hidden compartment and pressed it shut, the click echoing like a lock turning on a promise. He stared at the box in the dim light, his reflection faint in the brass hinge, and whispered the words under his breath, meant to outlast all of us. For the first time since a funeral, the coin felt less like a burden and more like a calling. He didn't know what secrets it held or how he would uncover them, but he felt the presence of his grandfather in every shaky line of ink. The laughter of classmates and relatives seemed distant now, unimportant compared to the certainty that the coin carried a story waiting to be revealed. He placed it back in the box, closed the lid, and rested it against his chest. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was no longer filled with the sound of jeers or the weight of emptiness. It was filled with a steady, guiding voice of his grandfather, reminding him that he was not alone, that the past had not abandoned him, and that the coin's true worth was still waiting in the shadows of time. The idea came to Eli on a gray Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the foster house felt too crowded and too empty all at once. The other children were fighting over the television, their voices carrying through the thin walls, and the foster parents had long since given up trying to break it up. Eli sat on the edge of his bed upstairs, the wooden box open in his lap, the coin resting in his palm. He kept hearing his grandfather's words from the letter, the phrase about how the coin was meant to outlast all of us. But what did that mean, really? What if it was just another one of those things adults said to make hard times softer? He imagined what it would be like to have real money, not a coin that others laughed at. New shoes that weren't hand-me-downs. A backpack without a broken zipper. Even enough cash to prove to the others that he wasn't just the orphan with a trinket. The thought pressed against him until it became unbearable. If the coin was valuable, someone outside his grandfather's word should know. Someone who dealt in money and objects every day. The pawn shop sat on the corner of Main Street, squeezed between a laundromat and a shuttered diner. Its windows were lined with guitars, power tools, and shells of tarnished jewelry that glittered weakly in the dim light. A neon sign flickered above the door, buzzing faintly with the promise of cash for gold. Eli hesitated on the sidewalk, staring at the reflection of himself in the glass door. His jacket was too thin for the cold, his shoes scuffed, and the wooden box looked out of place in his hands. Still, he pushed the door open, a small bell ringing overhead. Inside, the air smelled faintly of dust and metal. Behind the counter stood a man with a thick beard, his sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms dusted with hair and scars from years of handling tools. He glanced up, clearly surprised to see a boy standing there alone. "What can I do for you, kid?" he asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Eli placed a wooden box on the counter, sliding it open with a careful hand. The coin caught the light of the overhead lamp, but its dull sheen betrayed its age. He held it out, his voice barely above a whisper. I think this might be worth something." The man took the coin, rolling it between his thick fingers, turning it over to examine both sides. He squinted, then fetched a small magnifying glass from a drawer. For a long moment, Eli's heart lifted with hope. Perhaps this was it, the moment when someone would confirm what his grandfather had promised, when he would no longer be the boy mocked for carrying worthless metal. The man set the magnifying glass down and pushed the coin back across the counter. "Scrap value," he said flatly. "Maybe 10, 15 bucks, if I'm generous. Gold content's not much, and it's too worn for collectors. You'd be better off keeping it as a keepsake." Eli froze, the word stabbing deeper than he expected. Scrap value, barely worth lunch money. He stared at the coin resting against the counter's scratched glass, suddenly smaller, duller than ever. His throat tightened as he tried to form words, but none came. The man shrugged, already turning to rearrange the shelf behind him, clearly done with the conversation. With trembling fingers, Eli scooped the coin back into the box and closed it firmly. He muttered a thank you, though it sounded more like an apology, and turned toward the door. The bell jingled again as he stepped into the cold street, the sound mocking in its cheerfulness. He walked home slowly, his shoes scraping the pavement, the box pressed against his chest under his jacket. The pawn shop's verdict repeated in his mind until it drowned out everything else. Barely scrap value. Worthless. A trinket. The same words his relatives had implied. The same laughter from his classmates, now confirmed by someone whose job was to no value. By the time he reached his small room, his face was hot with humiliation, though no tears came. He set the box on the dresser, staring at it as though it had betrayed him. Yet even as the shame burned, he couldn't bring himself to let it go. He opened it once more, running his fingers over the coin's surface, and whispered his grandfather's words again, meant to outlast all of us. The phrase no longer felt like a promise. It felt like a riddle one he couldn't solve, but one he couldn't stop believing in either. The library was one of the few places where Eli felt invisible in a way that didn't hurt. The old brick building stood at the edge of Main Street, its tall windows clouded with years of dust, its heavy oak doors creaking when pushed open. Inside, the smell of paper and polish lingered, and the hush was constant, broken only by the rustle of pages or the occasional squeak of a chair against a worn wooden floor. Eli liked it there. No one asked questions, no one laughed at him, and no one cared that his shoes were scuffed or that his jacket sleeves didn't quite reach his wrists. He came on a Wednesday afternoon, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the wooden box tucked safely inside. The humiliation from the pawn shop still stung, and the laughter from his classmates echoed in the back of his mind. Yet his grandfather's letter had planted something in him, an itch he couldn't ignore. If the coin really was meant to outlast all of them, then somewhere, someone had to know why. The front desk was manned by Mrs. Whitaker, a thin woman with steel gray hair pinned into a bun and glasses that always seemed to slide down her nose. She had been a fixture of the library for as long as Eli could remember, moving through the stacks with the quiet grace of someone who belonged among books. Most kids avoided her, saying she was too stern, but Eli had noticed a softness in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. She looked up when he approached, her voice low but not unkind. "Back again, Eli?" He nodded, setting the box on the counter. His voice wavered as he spoke. I need help with something. It's about this coin." Her brows rose slightly, but she didn't dismiss him. Instead, she adjusted her glasses and leaned closer as he opened the box. The coin gleamed faintly under the desk lamp, its worn surface catching just enough light to show the faint traces of its engraving. Mrs. Whitaker lifted it carefully, turning it over in her fingers with precision of someone used to handling fragile things. She murmured, studying the faded eagle and the barely visible stars. "Old, certainly, but not ordinary." She glanced at him, her expression steady. "Why don't we see what we can find?" She led him into the reference section, where shelves towered above, filled with volumes coated in dust. She pulled down thick catalogs of coinage, some with cracked spines, others with faded titles nearly unreadable. They settled at a long wooden table, the light dim except for the small green-shaded lamp that cast a pool of glow over the pages. Together, they flipped through the catalogs. Mrs. Whitaker moved methodically, her finger tracing columns of dates, mint marks, and engravings. Eli leaned in, comparing the illustrations to the coin in his hand. Many were close, but none were exact. Some bore the eagle, some the stars, but always the details were slightly wrong. The size, the font of the letters, the arrangement of the design, something was always different. At one point, Mrs. Whitaker leaned back, tapping the page with her finger. "Here," she said. The entry described experimental mintings from the late 19th century, small batches struck as trials but never released into circulation. Most were destroyed, but rumors lingered of a few escaping into private hands. Eli's heart quickened as he read the words. Experimental, destroyed, rare. It sounded like the very thing his grandfather had hinted at. Mrs. Whitaker closed the catalog gently, her eyes narrowing in thought. "Coins like this," she said softly, "don't usually end up in a boy's pocket by accident. If your grandfather gave it to you, he must have known something. Eli nodded, clutching the coin tightly. The warmth of her words steadied him, giving him something to hold on to against the memory of jeers and dismissals. He wasn't crazy for believing it mattered. He wasn't foolish for carrying it everywhere. Someone else finally saw what he saw. As he packed the box back into his bag, Mrs. Whitaker touched his arm lightly. "Come back when you're ready. I'll help you keep looking." Sometimes the truth takes time to uncover, especially when it's been hidden this long. Eli left the library with a strange mix of hope and dread. The streets outside were cold and gray, but inside his backpack, the coin felt heavier than before, not as a burden, but as a secret, one that had finally begun to take shape. The library had become Eli's second home. After school, while the other children scattered to sports practices or video games, he would make his way to the tall brick building, slip through the heavy doors, and settle into the quiet corners of the reference section. Mrs. Whitaker often pretended not to notice, though she would occasionally leave an extra stack of catalogs at his table or slide a magnifying glass across the polished wood with a simple, "You might find this useful." It was late one evening, the winter sky already dark though the clock read barely past 5, when Eli sat hunched over the coin again. The green-shaded lamp on the table cast a circle of light, and within the coin lay waiting, its surface dull, its edges softened with time. He had studied it so many times that he thought he had seen everything there was to see, but with a magnifying glass pressed close to his eye, details emerged that ordinary glances had never revealed. The rim caught his attention first. At a casual look, it seemed smooth, worn by decades of handling. But under the glass, faint lines appeared, shallow grooves that wrapped around the edge in irregular intervals. At first, he thought they were scratches, the kind of damage that came from being dropped or carried for years. But the more he adjusted the light, tilting the coin slowly, the more he realized they were deliberate. They were not words, not in any alphabet he knew. They were tiny shapes, precise and symmetrical. A triangle here, a circle there, a series of lines intersecting like a compass star, some repeated, though never in the same sequence, and all were so faint they could be overlooked without effort. Eli's pulse quickened as he traced them with his finger, the ridges barely perceptible to touch. He leaned closer, the glass nearly pressed to the metal. "Symbols," he whispered, though no one was near enough to hear. They weren't decorations. They were too small, too purposeful. Whoever placed them there had hidden them with care, knowing they would survive only if someone looked closely enough. The thought brought his grandfather's letter rushing back into his mind. Meant to outlast all of us. He felt a shiver run through him. This was no ordinary coin. It carried something beneath its surface, a message or a marker intended for someone who would care enough to find it. His grandfather had trusted him with it, even knowing how others would laugh. He scribbled the shapes onto a sheet of paper, copying them carefully with the stub of a pencil Mrs. Whitaker had left behind. His drawings looked uneven, but they captured the essence. The repeating star, the crescent, the pair of parallel lines that appeared 4 times in a row. He filled the page with them until the coin's rim was mapped in graphite smudges. When Mrs. Whitaker passed by to collect a stack of books, she paused, glancing at his work. Her expression changed, subtle but sharp, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Where did you see those?" she asked quietly. "On the coin," Eli said, his voice barely steady. "Along the edge. Look." He held it out with both hands. She lifted the magnifying glass and studied the rim herself. Her silence stretched long, and Eli felt the air in the room thicken. At last, she lowered the coin onto the table. "You're right. These aren't standard mint marks. Someone put them there intentionally. And if your grandfather gave it to you, then he knew exactly what they meant." Her words echoed in his chest long after she returned to her desk. Eli sat staring at the coin, the page of symbols beside it, feeling both frightened and exhilarated. The world outside the library was ordinary, full of kids who laughed and adults who dismissed him. But here, under the light, with the magnifying glass revealing secrets hidden in plain sight, he began to believe his grandfather's promise. The coin was not just a keepsake. It was a puzzle, and he was the one meant to solve it. The assignment had sounded simple when the teacher first announced it. Bring in something connected to American history and prepare a short presentation. Most of Eli's classmates groaned at the thought of homework, but he had felt a flicker of excitement. For once, he had something real to show, not borrowed or imagined. The coin had been in his pocket every day since the funeral, a secret weight he carried with him, but now he saw a chance to let it mean something more. His grandfather's letter had said the coin was meant to outlast them all. Maybe this was the beginning of proving that. All weekend, Eli worked at the kitchen table of the foster home, copying passages from library books and sketching the faint symbols he had discovered along the coin's rim. The foster parents didn't ask what he was doing, and the other children barely noticed him hunched over the pages. But he didn't care. He wrote about the history of coinage, about how money wasn't just currency, but a story of a nation's struggles and victories. He included notes about experimental mintings from the late 19th century, the ones Mrs. Whitaker had shown him in the dusty catalogs. He tried to explain that the coin in his hand might not be ordinary at all. By Monday, he had filled 3 notebook pages and carefully tucked the coin back into the wooden box. When his turn came, he walked in front of the classroom with more confidence than usual, placing the box gently on the teacher's desk. His classmates leaned forward, some out of curiosity, most out of habit, waiting for something to laugh at. This, Eli began, opening the lid, is a $5 gold coin. It belonged to my grandfather, and it might be one of the experimental coins made at the mint in the late 1800s. A lot of them were destroyed, but some may have survived. There are markings along the edge that aren't supposed to be there, symbols that could mean it's part of something rare. He held it up, the light catching its surface. For a brief moment, the room was silent. He could almost imagine they saw what he saw, that the coin carried history, mystery, and value beyond its worn face. But the silence didn't last. A few snickers started in the back row. One boy whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Here we go again with the trinket." Eli's throat tightened, but he pressed on, reading from his notes. He explained about Charles Barber, the engraver, about the rumors of lost coins, about how not all history was found in textbooks. He wanted them to see that this wasn't just about money. It was about a story passed down through generations. When he finished, the teacher took the coin from him, turning it once in his hand before setting it back in the box. His expression was flat, his voice clipped. "Thank you, Eli, but this isn't really what I had in mind. The assignment was to connect your object clearly to American history. This coin," he tapped the box dismissively, "isn't verified. It's just a family keepsake. Irrelevant to the lesson." The word struck harder than the laughter. Irrelevant, as if the coin his grandfather, even his effort to explain it, meant nothing. The giggles from his classmates grew louder, and the teacher didn't bother to quiet them this time. Eli stood frozen for a moment, his notes trembling in his hand, before he closed the box and returned to his seat. For the rest of the day, he barely heard the lessons. The word repeated itself in his head, louder than anything else. Irrelevant. He pressed the coin into his palm under the desk, the ridged edge biting into his skin, grounding him. To them, it might be nothing. To his teacher, it might be just a trinket. But his grandfather had believed it mattered, and Mrs. Whitaker had seen what others had not. Eli decided then that even if every voice around him dismissed it, he would not. He would carry it, study it, and guard it until the day its truth silenced every laugh. The fair stretched across the town green, rows of canvas tents fluttering in the breeze, their tables crowded with curiosities that seemed pulled from attics and forgotten barns. The smell of fried dough and roasted peanuts lingered in the air, and the sound of a fiddler playing on the corner drifted above the steady hum of voices. Families moved from booth to booth, haggling over porcelain dolls, Civil War letters, and boxes of vinyl records stacked like relics of another century. Eli walked quietly among them, the wooden box clutched tight under his arm. He had not told his foster parents where he was going. They would have only shrugged or laughed. The coin had weighed on him for weeks, its mystery pressing harder since the discovery of the strange symbols and the sting of his teacher's dismissal. Mrs. Whitaker had encouraged him to keep looking, and when he saw the flyer for the antique fair taped to the library door, something in him insisted he go. If anyone might recognize the coin, perhaps it would be here, among people who traded in the past. He wandered the rows until his eyes caught a table laid with glass cases, each lined with velvet and filled with coins arranged in careful order. Silver dollars, colonial coppers, and polished tokens gleamed under the weak autumn sun. Behind the table sat an older man with a weathered face. His white hair brushed neatly back. A magnifying loupe still clipped to one eye even as he sipped from a paper cup of coffee. The sign propped beside him read, "Retired numismatist, appraisals and consultation." Eli's heart quickened. He approached slowly, setting the wooden box on the edge of the table. The man raised an eyebrow but said nothing as Eli opened the lid and lifted the coin into the light. Could you tell me about this?" Eli asked, his voice catching in his throat. The man reached for it without hesitation, his fingers surprisingly steady. He turned it over once, then again, tilting it slightly so the sun caught the faint engravings along the rim. His eyes narrowed, the loupe pressed closer. For a long moment he said nothing, and Eli's stomach twisted with anticipation. Finally, the man set the coin down sharply, as though it had burned him. "That shouldn't even exist," he muttered, his voice low but firm. Eli blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "What do you mean?" he asked, leaning forward. The man shook his head, pushing the coin back toward him. "Best keep that put away, boy. Some things are better left in boxes." "But," Eli started, desperation spilling into his words. "My grandfather left it to me. He said it was meant to outlast us all. Please, can you tell me what it is?" The man's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the crowd as though afraid of being overheard. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've seen drawings, mentions in old ledgers. Coins that were never supposed to leave the mint. Prototypes. Patterns. Most destroyed. If one slipped out," he trailed off, shaking his head again. "You shouldn't be showing it here." Eli's pulse raced. "But is it valuable? Is it real?" The man avoided his eyes, packing his magnifying glass into a case as though suddenly busy. "Go on now," he said, his tone brusque. "Don't ask more. Don't let others see. Not everyone who notices will tell you to keep it safe." Eli picked up the coin slowly, his hand trembling, and slipped it back into the wooden box. He wanted to press the man for answers, but the wall of silence between them was impenetrable. The numismatist busied himself with his cases, refusing to look up again. As Eli stepped back into fair, the sounds of laughter and haggling rushed in around him, but they felt distant. His grandfather's letter echoed in his mind, the words about outlasting them all, now sharpened by the stranger's warning. The coin was no longer just a mystery. It was a secret, one that others recognized but would not explain. He held the box tighter against his chest, both unsettled and more determined than ever. Whatever truth was hidden in that piece of metal, it was not meant to be ordinary, and one day he would uncover it. The following week, Eli returned to the library with the same mixture of hope and unease that had followed him since the fair. The words of the old numismatist still clung to him, asterisks that shouldn't even exist. Asterisks he hadn't told anyone else about the encounter, not even Mrs. Whitaker, but the warning left him restless, carrying the wooden box tighter against his side, as though it might be stolen if he loosened his grip. He found her at her usual place behind the reference desk, her glasses low on her nose, a stack of cataloging slips spread neatly before her. She looked up when he entered, as if she had been expecting him. "Back again," she said, her voice carrying the gentlest trace of approval. "Did you bring the coin?" He nodded and followed her into the quiet back corner, where tall shelves muffled the sounds of the rest of the library. She had already set aside several large volumes, their spines cracked, their titles faded in gilt lettering. "I've been digging a little," she admitted, motioning for him to sit. "Your coin has been bothering me. Too many things about it don't fit." Eli opened the box and set the coin on the table, the light from a green-shaded lamp falling across its worn surface. Mrs. Whitaker didn't reach for it this time. Instead, she pulled one of the heavy books closer and flipped through the pages with practiced hands. She stopped at a section thick with tables of dates and production numbers, rows of figures that seemed endless. Tucked between them was a brief note that caught her eye. She pointed with one finger. "Here," she said, "a report from 1887. It mentions a series of pattern strikes, experimental coins tested for new designs. They were never circulated. Officially, they were melted down, but She turned another page, her voice trailing as she scanned the lines. There were whispers, even at the time, that a shipment went missing before it reached the smelter. Eli leaned closer, his breath catching. Missing? You mean like stolen? Not necessarily stolen, she replied, her tone measured. Sometimes records were poorly kept or pieces disappeared quietly. Craftsmen or officials might have set some aside, though never openly. If your great-great-grandfather worked at the mint, as your grandfather's letter suggests, it's possible one ended up in his possession. And if this is one of them, she let the thought hang. Eli's pulse quickened as he studied the coin again. The faint symbols along the rim suddenly felt less like oddities and more like fingerprints of a hidden history. So there could be more, he asked. Mrs. Whitaker nodded slowly. There were rumors of an entire hoard, dozens of experimental coins, some with markings that didn't match any official record. Collectors have searched for them for generations. Most dismissed the stories as myth. But if even one survived, she finally looked at him, her eyes sharp but kind. It would be proof that the stories were true. The air between them grew heavy. Eli thought of the laughter in the classroom, the dismissive tone of the pawn shop owner, the mocking faces of relatives. All of them had been so certain it was worthless, nothing but a trinket. And yet here, in the quiet of the library, with an old catalog open on the table, the possibility of something greater took shape. His grandfather's words were no longer just comfort. They were evidence of a truth long buried. Mrs. Whitaker closed the book gently, careful with its fragile spine. If this coin is what I think it is, it won't be an easy road. People have spent lifetimes chasing legends like this. Some would pay dearly for even a chance at it. Others might not want it known at all. She paused, her gaze steady on him. You must be careful who you show it to. Eli slid the coin back into its box, his hands trembling slightly. For the first time, the object that felt like a burden began to feel like a key. Somewhere out there, a missing collection waited, and in his possession lay a fragment of it. He had no idea yet how dangerous or valuable that truth might be, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. His grandfather had been right. The coin was never meant to be ordinary, and its story was only beginning to unfold. The Foster home was rarely quiet. The television seemed to run from morning until late at night. Voices rose over small arguments, and the kitchen was always cluttered with plates that no one seemed eager to wash. In the middle of it all, Eli tried to keep his world small, retreating to the corner of his room with the wooden box on his lap. He would open it when no one else was watching, studying the coin as if the answers to his life were hidden in the faint grooves of its surface. To him, it was not just metal. It was memory, a riddle, a promise. But to the people around him, it was just another oddity to laugh at. One evening, when the house was buzzing with the smell of microwave dinners and the clatter of dishes, one of his foster brothers spotted the box on the table beside Eli. "What's in there?" the boy asked, his tone already edged with mischief. Eli shook his head and tried to close the lid, but curiosity had already drawn others over. Soon, the foster mother appeared, folding her arms, her eyes narrowing as she caught a glimpse of the coin inside. "That again?" she said, her voice sharp with impatience. "You're still carrying that thing around? It's just a coin, Eli. You act like it's treasure." Eli straightened in his chair, gripping the box as if she might snatch it away. "It was my grandfather's," he muttered. "It's important." The foster father, sitting heavily at the head of the table, chuckled without looking up from his newspaper. "Important? Kid, that coin won't even buy you a sandwich. Better off trading it in for a couple of dollars. Go get yourself some candy or a new comic book." The other children laughed at the suggestion, voices overlapping with mockery. "Yeah, Eli, guess all candy," one of them shouted. Another chimed in, "Bet the store clerk won't even take it. Probably fake." Eli felt the heat rise in his face, the words digging into him more deeply than he wanted to admit. He tried to hold the box tighter, his shoulders hunched, as though he could shield it from their ridicule. "It's not worthless," he said under his breath, but the room drowned him out. The foster mother sighed, her voice laced with irritation. "You can't keep living in the past, Eli. Whatever your grandfather told you, it doesn't change what that thing is. Just a trinket. Better you learn now that dreams don't pay for anything. He wanted to shout at them, to tell them they didn't know, that they hadn't read the letter hidden inside the box or seen the strange symbols carved into the coin's rim. He wanted to explain about Mrs. Whitaker's discovery of the missing collection, about the numismatist at the fair, who had whispered that it shouldn't even exist. But the words stuck in his throat. He knew they wouldn't listen. Instead, he stood slowly and carried the box upstairs to his room. He sat on the bed in the dim light, his fingers tracing the edges of the coin. The sound of laughter and the clinking of forks on plates carried through the thin walls, but he shut it out, holding the coin close. Their mockery left him bruised, but beneath it all, something else hardened inside him. Every time they dismissed it, every time they urged him to sell it for a few dollars of candy money, the coin seemed to grow heavier, more certain in his palm. If it truly meant nothing, why did so many people react to it all? Why did strangers hush their voices and avert their eyes when they saw it? Eli placed it back in the box carefully, sliding the letter beside it as though the two belonged together. He whispered his grandfather's words into the silence of his room, reminding himself of the promise inked in shaky handwriting. Meant to outlast all of us. One day, he told himself, the world would understand what they could not. Until then, he would endure their laughter. The coin was not candy money. It was history, and it was his. The library had become Eli's refuge in a way no other place could be. It was where the noise of the Foster house fell away, where the sharp laughter of classmates didn't echo, where the only voices were the whispers of pages turning. He had started spending whole afternoons in the back corner, surrounded by stacks of books that smelled of dust and leather, their bindings brittle with age. Mrs. Whitaker never hurried him. Sometimes she left boxes of old newspapers near his table, saying only, "Perhaps you'll find something useful here." It was in one of those boxes, a pile of yellowed sheets bound together with twine, that Eli found the clipping. The date at the top read March 3rd, 1893. The paper was fragile, its ink faded to a soft brown, but the words were still legible if he held it carefully under the lamp's glow. The headline was small, buried among stories of farm prices and railway disputes, but it stopped him cold. Shipment of pattern coins fails to arrive in Washington. His heart began to beat faster as he read. The article described how the Philadelphia Mint had sent a small consignment of experimental half-eagles, $5 pieces meant only for internal review, to the capital. The shipment, according to the report, had never reached its destination. The government officially blamed a clerical error, suggesting the coins had been melted down in error or misplaced. Yet the article hinted at rumors. Some whispered that the wagon carrying the shipment had been waylaid. Others that the coins had been quietly siphoned away by someone within the mint itself. Eli leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass covering the lamp. The description matched too closely to ignore. Pattern coins, $5 gold pieces, lost on the way to Washington. His fingers trembled as he traced a line about a mystery likely never to be solved. He thought of his grandfather's letter, the words about the coin being meant to outlast them all. He thought of the faint engravings along the rim, symbols that no ordinary mintage carried. And now, here was proof that such coins had once existed, that a batch of them had gone missing more than a century ago. If even one had survived, if it had passed to the hands of craftsmen, families, generations, could it be the one now in his possession? Mrs. Whitaker appeared at his side, silent as always, peering down at the clipping. She adjusted her glasses, reading quickly before nodding with the smallest trace of satisfaction. "That," she said softly, "is exactly the kind of record I hoped you might find." Eli looked up at her, the weight of the discovery pressing on him. "So it's real," he whispered. "It really could be one of them." Her gaze lingered on the fragile page. "It's possible, too possible. But remember, Eli, if this clipping survived, others may know of it too. And people who chase after legends rarely do so kindly." He folded the article carefully, making a copy of the text in his notebook before sliding the original back into its folder. As he wrote, his mind swirled with images. The wagon rolling down a muddy road in 1893, the coins hidden away, the mystery buried in official silence. Now, more than a century later, one of those coins might be sitting in a wooden box in his backpack. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. For the first time, he had something tangible, something outside of whispers and dismissals. He had a piece of history staring back at him from the faded ink of a forgotten newspaper. And though the world still laughed and called it worthless, Eli knew now with absolute certainty that the coin carried a story far greater than anyone had dared to believe. The jeweler's shop was tucked into a narrow corner of Main Street, its windows crowded with displays of wedding bands and pocket watches that gleamed under soft yellow lights. It was the kind of place most people passed without a glance, but Eli lingered outside for several minutes, his hand tight around the wooden box hidden beneath his jacket. He had debated for days whether to bring the coin here. Mrs. Whitaker had told him that if he wanted certainty, he would need someone with the right tools, someone who could look beyond the obvious scratches and wear. Still, the thought of exposing it to yet another adult who might scoff at him made his stomach twist. When he finally pushed open the door, a bell chimed overhead, announcing him into a room that smelled faintly of polish and old velvet. Behind the glass counter, a tall man with thinning hair and a magnifier perched on his forehead looked up from the ring he was examining. His voice was steady, practiced from years of small talk. "Afternoon. Looking for something?" Eli approached slowly, placing the box on the counter. His voice wavered, but he managed the words. "Could you look at this? It's a coin. I think there might be something on it." The jeweler raised an eyebrow, but his curiosity seemed genuine. He flipped open the lid, and his expression softened slightly. "An old half-eagle," he murmured. "Not something I see every day." He picked it up with surprising care, holding it to the light. "Pretty worn, though." "I think there's something near the edge," Eli said quickly, afraid the man might dismiss it too soon. "Letters, maybe, but they're hard to see." The jeweler slid the coin under his bench light and lowered the magnifier over one eye. He turned it slowly, studying the rim with meticulous patience. Eli leaned forward, his heart pounding, watching every flick of the man's wrist. For several minutes, the silence was broken only by the faint hum of the lamp. Then, almost abruptly, the jeweler let out a small sound, halfway between surprise and recognition. "There are initials here," he said, his voice quieter now. He reached for a fine-pointed tool and traced gently along the rim, not to scratch, but to point. Very faint. Most people wouldn't notice unless they were looking. But yes, see here? A C. And just after it, what looks like a B. Eli swallowed hard. "Do you know whose?" The jeweler leaned back, removing the magnifier. His expression was thoughtful, cautious even. "Charles Barber, chief engraver at the Mint in the late 1800s. Design coins, patterns, experimental pieces. If these are his initials, boy, you're holding something unusual. Very unusual." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than the coin itself. Eli's mind raced back to the old newspaper clipping, the missing shipment of experimental coins, the whispered rumors of a vanished hoard. Now here was a mark, faint but undeniable, tying his grandfather's coin to the very man responsible for those designs. The jeweler placed the coin back into the box and closed the lid gently. His tone shifted, low and deliberate. "You should be careful who you show this to. There are collectors out there who would pay fortunes for something like this, and others who wouldn't hesitate to take it by less honest means." Eli nodded, clutching the box as though it might vanish if he loosened his grip. He wanted to ask 100 more questions, but the man's expression made it clear the conversation was over. Some truths, it seemed, carried weight that could not be spoken freely. As he stepped back out into the street, the air felt sharper, charged with meaning. The initials were real. The connection to Barber was real. For the first time, the coin story had moved beyond whispers and speculation. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind again, steady and insistent. "Meant to outlast all of us." Eli walked home with the box pressed close to his chest, every step carrying both fear and resolve. The coin was no longer just a keepsake. It was evidence, inscribed with a name that history had nearly hidden. And now it was up to him to guard it, no matter the cost. The afternoon had been ordinary enough when Eli left the library, the wooden box tucked into his backpack the way it always was. He had spent hours with Mrs. Whitaker, poring over catalogs and tracing the faint initials the jeweler had confirmed. the discovery still pulsed in his mind like a secret flame, something too important to tell the wrong people, yet too heavy to keep to himself. As he stepped out into the cold twilight, the streets of the town were busy with the usual rhythms. Cars humming along Main Street, shop doors closing, the smell of fried food drifting from the diner at the corner. Nothing felt unusual until he noticed a man. At first, Eli thought it was coincidence. The man leaned against the brick wall near the library steps, lighting a cigarette with hands that shook slightly. His clothes were plain, a dark coat and scuffed shoes, but his eyes followed Eli a little too long. Eli quickened his pace, telling himself not to imagine things. Yet when he turned down Oak Street, he heard footsteps fall into rhythm behind him. He glanced back. The man was there, keeping distance but never losing sight of him. Eli's throat tightened. He turned again at the next corner, hoping the stranger would pass, but the sound of shoes on pavement followed like an echo. He gripped the strap of his backpack tighter, the coin's weight suddenly more noticeable, almost burning through the fabric. By the time he reached a quieter stretch near the foster home, the man closed the distance. "Hey, kid," he called, his voice rough, carrying too easily through the evening air. "Hold up a second." Eli's steps faltered. He wanted to run, but his legs felt rooted. The man drew closer, his face shadowed under the brim of his hat. "You've been carrying something," he said, lowering his voice now. "A gold piece. Where'd you get it?" The words cut through Eli like a blade. He hugged his backpack closer, shaking his head. "I don't know what you mean." The man smirked, though his eyes were hard. "Don't play dumb. People talk. A little orphan boy, always fiddling with some coin. You think nobody notices? Tell me where you got it." Eli's heart pounded so hard it drowned out the fading sounds of the street. He thought of his grandfather's letter, of Mrs. Whitaker's warnings, of the jeweler's hushed voice urging caution. This was what they had meant. Others knowing, others looking. He took a step back, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's mine." The man's expression shifted, frustration creeping into his features. He leaned closer, his tone sharp. "Things like that don't belong to kids. Hand it over. You'll just lose it anyway." Fear surged through Eli, but with it came something else. Stubbornness. He shook his head, clutching the straps of his backpack, until his fingers hurt. "No." For a tense moment, the air between them seemed to freeze. Then the man cursed under his breath, glancing around as though realizing the street wasn't as empty as he wanted. A dog barked somewhere nearby, and a porch light flicked on down the block. He stepped back, his voice a low growl. "Careful, boy. Some things are worth more than you can imagine, and people don't always ask nicely." With that, he turned sharply and disappeared into the alley, leaving only the smell of smoke lingering in the air. Eli stood frozen until his legs finally obeyed, carrying him quickly toward the foster house. Inside, the noise of television and clattering dishes greeted him as if nothing had happened. But he ran upstairs to his room, slamming the door and sliding the lock. He pulled the box from his backpack, setting it on the bed, his hands trembling. The stranger's words echoed in his mind. Asterisk things like that don't belong to kids. Asterisk, but it did belong to him. His grandfather had trusted him, written his name on the letter, placed a coin in his care. He wouldn't let anyone take it. As fear slowly gave way to resolve, he whispered again the phrase he knew by heart, the one that steadied him, meant to outlast all of us. Tonight, the words felt less like comfort and more like a warning. Eli had not planned on telling anyone else about the coin, not after the stranger's threat, and the way the pawn shop owner, his classmates, and even his foster family had laughed. Yet secrets had a way of pressing on him until they needed to be spoken, and Mrs. Whitaker had gently pushed him toward the idea of seeking someone with deeper knowledge. One afternoon, while sorting through a pile of journals in the library's reading room, she handed him a business card printed on thick cream paper. The name stood out in elegant black type. Professor Andrew Lowe, Numismatic History, U.S. Mint Specialist. "He lectured here once, years ago," Mrs. Whitaker explained. "Writes for the American Numismatic Review. If anyone could give you a straight answer, it would be him. But be cautious, Eli. Some truths can't be untold once spoken." Eli tucked the card carefully into his notebook, unsure if he would ever use it. Days passed before he gathered the courage. When he finally did, his hand shook as he dialed a number from a payphone outside the library. His voice cracked as he explained he had something unusual, a coin with markings that didn't match anything ordinary. He expected laughter, dismissal, maybe even anger for wasting the man's time. Instead, there had been a pause on the other end, then a voice deep and measured. "Bring it by. I'd like to see it." The meeting was set for the following Saturday at the university, where Professor Lowell kept an office. The campus seemed enormous to Eli, the stone buildings towering like monuments, students moving in clusters with books tucked under their arms. He felt out of place in his worn jacket and scuffed shoes, but the wooden box under his arm grounded him. He found the office after climbing 2 flights of marble stairs, the brass nameplate glinting under fluorescent light. Professor Lowell was nothing like Eli imagined. His hair was more silver than brown, his beard neatly trimmed, his suit jacket patched at the elbows. His office smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. Every surface was stacked with books, ledgers, trays of coins, and framed prints of historic engravings. He looked up from his desk when Eli entered, his eyes sharp but not unkind. "You must be Eli," he said, motioning toward a chair. "Mrs. Whitaker mentioned you might call. Now, let's see what you brought." Eli set the box on the desk, opening it with care. The professor leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. He lifted the coin delicately, as though handling something fragile, and studied it under the desk lamp. He turned it slowly, his thumb brushing the edge. Then he reached for a magnifying lens, his expression tightening as he focused on the faint markings along the rim. "Well," he murmured, more to himself than to Eli, "this is interesting, very interesting." Eli shifted nervously in his chair. "Do you know what it is?" Professor Lowell leaned back, the coin still in his hand. "The initials are clear enough, C.B., Charles Barber, chief engraver of the mint in the late 19th century. I've spent most of my career studying his work. What you have here isn't ordinary. It resembles the 1880s pattern half-eagles, coins struck in extremely limited numbers, none of which were supposed to survive." Eli's heart pounded. "So it's real? It could be one of the missing ones." The professor's eyes flickered, a mix of excitement and caution. "If it is what it appears to be, then yes. But coins like this are not just valuable. They're controversial. The mint has long denied their survival. Collectors whisper about them. Some claim to have seen one, but no proof ever surfaced. If you truly possess one," he set the coin down gently and folded his hands, "it would change more than you realize." Eli stared at the coin, the weight of the words sinking in. All the laughter, the jeers, the threats, they faded against the possibility that his grandfather's gift was more than just a keepsake. It was history itself, hiding in his palm. Professor Lowell's gaze softened as he looked at him. "Your grandfather entrusted you with something extraordinary. Guard it well, and be careful who you trust. Not everyone will want this truth to come to light." Eli nodded, sliding the coin back into its box. As he left the office, the sound of students' voices filled the hallway, ordinary and carefree. Yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. The scholar's interest had confirmed what his heart already believed. The coin was no accident, no trinket. It was a key to a story long buried, and for better or worse, it was now his to carry. The laboratory smelled faintly of chemicals and the sterile sharpness of polished steel. The walls were lined with cabinets of instruments Eli didn't recognize, their blinking lights and glass displays making the room feel more like a place for doctors than for coins. Professor Lowell guided him inside with a calm, steady hand on his shoulder, speaking quietly with a technician who wore a white coat and protective glasses. The man nodded as the professor handed him a small form, then gestured toward a wide, gleaming table in the center of the room. Eli set the wooden box down gently. For the first time since he'd begun carrying it everywhere, he felt hesitant to open it, as though the coin might vanish once removed from his care. Yet the professor gave him an encouraging nod, and Eli lifted the lid, exposing the coin to the sterile light. It looked smaller than usual under the bright lamps, its worn surface dull against the spotless metal of the table. The technician picked it up with gloved hands, slipping it into a tray that slid beneath a machine shaped like a large microscope. "We'll run a non-destructive test," he explained, his voice professional but not unkind. "We'll measure composition without damaging the piece." Eli nodded, though he barely understood the words. His eyes followed every movement as the machine hummed to life, a thin beam of light passing over the coin. Numbers began to appear on a small monitor, lines of percentages, and chemical symbols scrolling faster than he could read. Professor Lowell stood beside him, arms folded, eyes fixed on the data. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Eli's stomach knotted, his mind swinging between hope and dread. What if the machine confirmed what the pawn shop had said, that it was nothing but scrap? What if all the whispers, the initials, the old clippings amounted to nothing more than coincidence? The technician adjusted a dial, leaned close to the screen, and then glanced at Lowell with raised eyebrows. "Purity is unusually high," he said slowly. 23.8 carats. Standard U.S. circulation coins of that period were closer to 21.6. "This doesn't match." Eli's breath caught. He wasn't sure what the numbers meant, but he knew the shift in tone. Professor Lowell leaned closer, his eyes alight with a mixture of wonder and caution. "So it's outside the norm?" The technician nodded. "Definitely. And there's trace metal content here. Palladium, very slight. That's not typical of any half-eagle I've seen. It suggests this wasn't meant for circulation. Likely experimental." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Eli stared at the monitor, at the glowing numbers that had just given voice to what he had always suspected. The coin wasn't ordinary. It wasn't a trinket. It wasn't worthless. It was different, designed for something more, something that had never reached the public. Professor Lowell rested a hand on Eli's shoulder, his voice quiet but firm. "This confirms it. What you have was never meant to pass through everyday hands. It belongs to a class of objects that historians only whisper about. Experimental strikes. Rare, hidden, sometimes denied outright." Eli swallowed hard, his eyes dropping to the wooden box waiting on the table. For weeks he had carried it everywhere, mocked, dismissed, even threatened. Now, in the cold certainty of numbers and science, it had become something else entirely, a piece of truth too sharp to ignore. The technician carefully removed the coin from the machine, placing it back into the box with almost reverent precision. "Whatever its story is, it's not something I'd leave lying around," he said. Eli closed the lid slowly, his fingers trembling against the smooth wood. He felt the weight of his grandfather's words again, written in shaky ink. Meant to outlast all of us. For the first time, those words weren't just a mystery. They were proof, shining back at him from a screen of numbers that told the world what his heart already knew. As he left the lab with Professor Lowell, the sounds of the university returned. A distant chatter of students, the echo of footsteps in the halls. To them, life was ordinary. To Eli, everything had changed. The coin was no longer just his burden. It was history uncovered, and history demanded to be reckoned with. The discovery came on a Sunday afternoon, when the foster house was unusually quiet. The other children had been taken to visit relatives, and the foster parents busied themselves with errands, leaving Eli with a few rare hours alone. He climbed the narrow stairs to the attic, a place he had been forbidden to linger, but often crept into when he wanted silence. Dust hung thick in the air, filtering the pale light that seeped through a small window. Old trunks and boxes crowded the space, filled with items left behind by previous children or stored away by families who no longer cared to claim them. Eli moved carefully, setting aside broken toys and stacks of forgotten clothes until he reached the small chest he had hidden there weeks before. It held the handful of belongings that had come from his grandfather's house after the funeral, items most of the relatives had ignored, dismissing them as junk. Eli had kept them because he knew better. His grandfather never left anything without reason. He dragged the chest into the light and opened it. Inside lay tools, a folded quilt that still smelled faintly of cedar, and a bundle of papers tied with string. Beneath them all, pressed flat against the bottom, was a worn leather journal. Its cover was cracked, the corners fraying, but when Eli lifted it, the weight of it filled his hands with an odd sense of importance. The initials JT were faintly pressed into the leather, his great-great-grandfather's, perhaps, though Eli had only ever heard fragments of the name mentioned in family whispers. He carried the journal to the window and sat cross-legged on the wooden floor. The pages were brittle, but the ink, though faded, was still legible. He began to read, his lips moving silently as he followed the words. The entries were brief, written in a hand that shifted between careful lines and hurried scrawls. At first, they spoke of ordinary matters, weather, wages, the daily grind of long hours. But then a phrase caught him. Astor's, Philadelphia, March 1887. First day at the mint. Strange to see the machines up close. The noise is deafening, but the work feels important. Asterisk. Eli's pulse quickened. He flipped through more pages, his heart thudding as the references piled up. Mentions of presses, dies, and coins that never left the building. Notes about designs changed at the last moment. Shipments recorded in ledgers that never matched the actual count. One passage stopped him cold. Astor's pattern strikes examined today. Not for public eyes. Barber himself inspected them. Coins marked differently along the edge. Said they were for study only, never circulation. Some whispered that a few would slip into private hands. I do not ask how. Asterisk. The name, Barber, jumped out like a spark. Eli ran his fingers over the word, tracing the letters as if to anchor himself. It was the same name the jeweler had spoken, the same initials carved faintly into the coin's rim. His great-great-grandfather had not only known of the mint's experimental pieces, he had worked among them. Further entries hinted at unease. Astor's strange orders today. Boxes sealed and removed without record. Some say a shipment went missing on its way to Washington. I keep my head down. Safe not to know too much. Asterisk. Eli closed the book slowly, his mind racing. The coin in his possession was no longer just a relic left to him by chance. It was part of his family story, tied to an ancestor who had stood in the very rooms where those experiments took place. His grandfather must have known this, must have kept the journal hidden all these years, waiting for the moment Eli would need it. He placed the journal beside the wooden box, his hands trembling as he looked at them together. The coin, the letter, the initials on the rim, and now the ledger of a man who had lived the history others only speculated about. It was all connected, a chain stretching back more than a century, binding him to people he had never met but somehow carried within him. Downstairs, the sound of a car door slamming broke the silence. The Foster family had returned. Eli quickly gathered the journal, tucking it into his backpack beside the box. He knew he couldn't leave it behind. Not now, not ever. As he zipped the bag shut, his grandfather's words whispered through his memory once more. Meant to outlast all of us. The journal proved it. The coin was not an accident. His family had been part of its story from the beginning. And now, for reasons he was only beginning to understand, it had passed into his hands. Eli returned to the library the following week with the journal pressed tightly against his side, wrapped in a piece of cloth so the leather would not fray further. He had not told anyone else about it, not even the Foster family, who rarely asked where he went. Mrs. Whitaker was waiting at the reference desk, her usual pile of books before her. But when she saw the bundle in Eli's arms, her expression changed from mild curiosity to a sharp focus that made him hesitate. He laid the journal carefully on the counter and whispered, "It was my grandfather's. I think it belonged to his grandfather before him." They sat in the quiet reading room as she turned the pages with gloved hands, scanning the entries he had already memorized. Each time she paused and mentioned the mint, Eli leaned closer, as if to prove with his very presence that the words were real. When she reached the passage about Barber and the experimental coins, she drew in a slow breath. This isn't just family history, Eli. This is documentary evidence. If your ancestor worked at the Philadelphia Mint, we should be able to confirm it. The search took hours. Mrs. Whitaker guided him to microfilm reels stored in heavy drawers, reels that clicked and whirred as they spun through old government records and staff directories. The names scrolled past in faded type until at last there was John Turner, craftsman, Mint Engraving and Preservation Department, Philadelphia, 1886, 1892. Eli stared at the screen as though the letters might vanish if he blinked. Turner, his name, his great-great-grandfather, recorded not in family stories but in official history. Mrs. Whitaker smiled faintly. There's your connection. He was no laborer sweeping floors. Craftsman meant he worked directly with dyes and engraving, ensuring the preservation of experimental designs. He would have handled pieces no one outside those walls ever saw. The words lit something deep in Eli's chest. All the times he'd been called foolish for guarding the coin, all the dismissals that it was nothing but scrap, they unraveled beneath the weight of his confirmation. His family had touched history. They had not just carried the coin, they had shaped the very conditions of its existence. He copied the entry into his notebook, his handwriting uneven with excitement. Later, Mrs. Whitaker brought him to a locked cabinet and withdrew a published history of the mint. Together they traced the years John Turner had worked there, noting the turbulent period when Charles Barber introduced new patterns, many of which were quietly destroyed. The book spoke only in general terms, but the journal in Eli's bag gave life to those silences. By the time the library lights dimmed to signal closing, Eli felt the story settle inside him with a new kind of weight. The coin was no longer just a relic passed down from his grandfather. It was a direct thread through time, proof of a heritage others could not take from him. His great-great-grandfather had once stood in the mint's engraving room, perhaps turning the very dies that shaped the coin now in his possession. As he walked home, the evening air sharp against his face, Eli held the backpack straps so tight his knuckles whitened. The box, the journal, the record on the microfilm, they all formed a chain that bound him to something larger than himself. He thought of his grandfather's letter, of the shaky words that had seemed like comfort at first, but now read like truth, meant to outlast all of us. Eli understood, maybe for the first time, that he was not carrying only a coin. He was carrying his family's place in history, a legacy hidden from the world until now. And though he was still only a boy, mocked and overlooked, he felt a quiet strength rising in him. No laughter, no threats, no dismissals could erase what was already written into the past. Professor Lowell invited Eli back to his office a week later, asking him to bring both the coin and the journal. The man's tone over the phone had been measured, but there had been an urgency beneath his calm words, something that made Eli's chest tighten with both dread and anticipation. When he arrived, the professor was already waiting, his desk cleared of the usual piles of books, leaving only a lamp, a magnifying glass, and several heavy reference volumes spread open to marked pages. Eli sat across from him, setting the wooden box carefully on the desk. The professor leaned forward, opening it with deliberate care, as if unsealing a vault. The coin caught the lamplight and gleamed faintly, its worn surface betraying little of the storm it had caused in Eli's life. Lowell lifted it with tweezers, not touching it directly this time, and held it beneath the magnifier. His silence stretched, broken only by the faint scratching of his pen as he made notes on a yellow pad. Finally, he exhaled, his voice heavy. Eli, I need you to understand what you're holding. This is not just an old half-eagle. It isn't even a rare circulation coin. What you have here matches, in every significant detail, the descriptions of the Barber pattern piece, an experimental $5 gold coin struck in the early 1880s. Eli frowned slightly, unsure. Pattern piece? The professor nodded. Think of it like a prototype. Before design is approved for circulation, the mint produces a handful of test coins, patterns. They experiment with new engravings, new metals, sometimes even secretive symbols. Most are struck in very small numbers, often fewer than 10, and almost all are destroyed after review. The Barber patterns, in particular, were recorded as being melted down. He looked at Eli sharply, as if to impress the gravity of it, which means this coin shouldn't exist at all. Eli's breath caught. The words of the old numismatist at the fair came rushing back. That shouldn't even exist. Now, here it was again, but not as a muttered warning. This time it was fact, confirmed by someone who had spent his life studying such things. Lowell flipped through one of the books on his desk and turned it toward Eli. The page showed an old black and white illustration of a coin, its eagle more pronounced than most, its stars arranged slightly differently than the standard half-eagle of that period. Along the margin, in a historian's cramped handwriting, were notes about rim markings, unverified symbols not released. See this? the professor said, pointing to the page. "The description matches yours exactly. The initials on the rim, the faint geometric symbols. These were rumored to exist, but no verified specimen has ever surfaced. Collectors dismissed it as myth. And yet, he gestured to the coin resting between them. Here it is." Eli leaned closer, his pulse hammering his ears. The coin in the book and the coin in his box seemed to overlap, one image bleeding into the other until they were the same. For weeks he had clung to the idea that it was special, but hearing the truth spoken aloud felt like stepping into another world. Professor Lowell sat back heavily, removing his glasses. "This discovery is extraordinary, Eli, but it also puts you in a difficult place. If word spreads, collectors, museums, even the government may come forward. Some will want to buy it. Others may want to hide it. And still others might insist it belongs in official archives. You are young and this burden is unfair, but the reality is that coin in your possession rewrites a piece of history." Eli lowered his eyes to the box, his hand hovering over it. His grandfather's words pulsed through him again, meant to outlast all of us. Now he understood why. It wasn't only a family heirloom, not just a keepsake. It was a survivor, a piece of history that had defied destruction, carried forward through generations to land in his hands. When he finally looked up, his voice was quiet but steady. "So it's real. It's the coin they said was gone." Professor Lowell nodded solemnly. "Yes, Eli. It's the coin that shouldn't exist. And yet it does. And now, the question is what you're going to do with it." The room fell into silence, the coin resting between them like a heartbeat, small and unassuming, yet powerful enough to shake the ground beneath their feet. For the first time, Eli felt the full weight of his inheritance, not just the coin, but the responsibility that came with it. The invitation came in an envelope heavier than ordinary paper, sealed with the crest of the Historical Society. Professor Lowell had pressed it into Eli's hand one afternoon after school, his voice calm but urgent. "They've agreed to review it," he said. "A panel of the best, historians, numismatists, archivists. They won't be easy to convince, but this is the only way to silence doubt." The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday in the Old City Museum, a building with marble floors that echoed every footstep and ceilings so high they seemed to vanish into shadow. Eli walked beside Lowell to the Great Hall, his small figure dwarfed by glass cases filled with relics of the past. Uniforms from forgotten wars, brittle letters under protective glass, and shells of coins no one touched without gloves. He clutched the wooden box against his chest, his palms damp despite the cool air. The panel was waiting in a side room, seated around a long oak table polished to a dark shine. There were 7 of them, men and women whose names appeared in textbooks and journals Mrs. Whitaker had once shown him. Their expressions ranged from polite curiosity to sharp skepticism. Each had a folder in front of them, already filled with notes and references. Professor Lowell made introductions, his voice carrying across the silence. "This is Eli Turner, the custodian of the piece we are here to examine." The word custodian struck Eli, heavier than owner, heavier than heir. It carried duty, responsibility. At Lowell's gesture, Eli stepped forward and set the wooden box on the table. His fingers lingered on the lid before he opened it. The coin lay inside, its surface dull under the fluorescent lights, looking small and ordinary compared to the weight it carried. Yet when Lowell lifted it out with tweezers and placed it beneath the first magnifier, the room seemed to lean in at once. One by one, the experts took their turns. A historian with a clipped accent examined the engravings, comparing them to sketches from Barber's archives. A numismatist adjusted his spectacles, tracing the faint initials along the rim with a precision that left Eli holding his breath. A metallurgist brought out a portable analyzer, scanning the surface for confirmation of the unusual purity discovered earlier. Each made notes, their pens scratching in tense rhythm. Their voices kept low as they exchanged remarks Eli could barely follow. At last, the chair of the panel, a woman with silver hair pulled into a knot at the nape of her neck, set down her magnifier and folded her hands. "There is no doubt this coin matches descriptions of the Barber pattern half-eagle, presumed destroyed in 1887, she said carefully. "The initials are consistent, the purity outside circulation norms, the symbols along the rim unprecedented, but recorded in whispers of time. The question is not whether this coin is extraordinary. The question is how it has survived. A murmur swept the table. One man suggested it had been smuggled out by a mint worker. Another hinted at theft. Lowell cleared his throat. The boy's ancestor, John Turner, worked in engraving and preservation at the Philadelphia Mint. His journal records references to Barber, to the experimental strikes, even to missing shipments. The provenance is more than plausible. All eyes turned briefly to Eli, who sat stiff in his chair, the journal clutched in his lap. He wished his grandfather were there to speak for him, to explain how the coin had passed through so many hands to finally rest in his. But the words stuck in his throat, so he only nodded when Lowell placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. The panel continued their debate, voices rising and falling in cautious tones. Some spoke of the coin's historical importance, others of the complications it would bring if recognized publicly. One warned that revealing it might incite disputes over ownership, perhaps even government intervention. The tension pressed down on the room until it felt suffocating. When the session finally drew to a close, the chairwoman spoke again, her voice steady. "We will issue a preliminary report confirming authenticity. This is by all evidence a genuine Barber pattern piece. It is a discovery of great consequence." The weight of her words settled over Eli like a cloak. Around him, the experts packed their notes, their faces a mix of excitement and caution. But for him, the moment was both terrifying and affirming. The world had finally acknowledged what it always believed. The coin was not a worthless trinket. It was history itself, and it had chosen to survive through him. As he left the museum with Lowell, the echoes of the marble hall followed him out into the cold air. For the first time, the laughter and jeers of the past seemed far away. The experts had assembled, and they had seen the truth. But Eli also understood now what Lowell had warned him. Confirmation was only the beginning. The harder battles were still to come. News traveled faster than Eli expected. The report from the panel had not been made public in its entirety, but whispers had already begun to circle through the small town. Someone had spoken, perhaps one of the assistants at the museum, or maybe a curious member of the panel who could not resist sharing the story of the boy with the impossible coin. Within a week, people who had once ignored him began to look at him differently, some with curiosity, others with envy, and then the relatives appeared, the very same who had laughed at him in the church basement when he first opened the box. They arrived one evening without warning, their cars crunching over the gravel driveway of the Foster home. Eli saw them from the window of his small room, their figures climbing out of the vehicles with stiff purpose. Aunts and cousins he barely remembered, their expressions sharpened with greed now that the coin's existence carried value. He had not seen them since the funeral, when they had dismissed his inheritance as nothing but junk. Now they walked up the steps of the house, as if they had every right to be there. The foster mother met them at the door, startled by their sudden arrival, but they brushed past her protests, asking immediately for Eli. Their voices carried through the thin walls, demanding that he come downstairs. Reluctantly, he obeyed, clutching his backpack with a wooden box hidden inside. When he entered the living room, their eyes fell on him with a hunger that made his stomach twist. "Well, there he is," Aunt Marjorie said, her tone falsely sweet. "The boy with the coin. You caused quite a stir, Eli. And it seems you're sitting on something that belongs to the family, not just you." He tightened his grip on the bag. "It was left to me," he said quietly. A cousin stepped forward, his voice rising. "Don't play dumb. That coin is worth millions, they're saying. Do you think you get to keep it all? We're blood too. We deserve our share." Their words spilled over one another, a chorus of demands dressed up as claims of fairness. They spoke of family rights, of inheritance laws, of how his grandfather would never have intended for one boy to hold such wealth alone. Eli listened, his chest burning with a mix of anger and fear. He remembered their laughter at the funeral, their dismissal of the coin as worthless. None of them had wanted it then. None of them had cared about his grandfather's letter or the box that carried so much meaning. Now, with the truth revealed, they returned not with comfort but with claws. The foster father, usually indifferent, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The relatives' voices grew sharper, and soon the room felt suffocating. One of them reached toward Eli's bag, and he stumbled back, clutching it to his chest. "It's mine," he whispered, his voice breaking but firm. "He gave it to me." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words cutting through the noise. Then Aunt Marjorie scoffed, shaking her head. "You're just a child. You don't understand what you're holding. Someone needs to take responsibility before you lose it or worse. Hand it over, Eli. It'll be safer with us." But Eli remembered the strange in the street, the jeweler's warning, and Professor Lowell's careful words. He knew what they wanted was not safety. It was possession. He shook his head again, his voice steadier now. "It doesn't belong to you." Anger flickered across their faces. But before anyone could press further, the foster mother intervened, her patience frayed. She ordered them out, reminding them the house was not theirs to invade. They left reluctantly, muttering threats of lawyers and claims of rights as they slammed the door behind them. Eli retreated quickly to his room, locking the door and pulling the box out of his bag. His hands shook as he opened it, staring at the coin that had drawn so much attention. It seemed small, almost fragile, compared to the storm it had unleashed. Yet as he held it, he felt his grandfather's words again, grounding him, meant to outlast all of us. They could demand, they could threaten, they could even try to take it by force. But they hadn't been chosen. He had. And for the first time, he began to understand what that truly meant. The coin wasn't just wealth. It was trust, history, and a legacy that no amount of greed could erase. The auction house sat at the edge of the city, like a fortress of glass and stone, its tall doors opening into a world Eli had only seen in magazines left behind in waiting rooms. Inside, chandeliers glittered above polished floors, and the air carried a faint perfume of wealth, leather, old paper, and the quiet confidence of people who had never been told no. Professor Lowell walked beside him, offering a steady presence, but even his calm demeanor could not keep Eli's hands from trembling around the wooden box. They were led into a private room away from the grand showroom, where rows of velvet chairs and a mahogany podium waited for the next evening's sale. Here, everything was quieter, more deliberate. Behind a wide desk sat a man in a tailored suit, his hair silver at the temples, his cufflinks catching the light each time he moved his hands. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrington, senior auctioneer, a man whose voice could turn a simple object into a treasure in front of the right crowd. He gestured for Eli to sit, his eyes fixed on the box even before it was set down. "So this is it," he said smoothly. "The coin everyone has been whispering about." Eli opened the lid with care. The coin lay in the soft light, unassuming yet impossible to ignore. Harrington reached for it with gloved hands, lifting it delicately before holding it under a magnifier. He studied it in silence for a long time, turning it slowly, nodding once as if confirming something to himself. Finally, he set it down, folded his hands, and leaned forward. "My boy," he began, his tone both warm and heavy, "what you have here could change your life. This is not merely a rare coin. It is a ghost, one long thought destroyed. In this business, rarity is everything, and this is the rarest of them all." Eli sat frozen, uncertain how to respond, his mind filled with the voices of his relatives demanding their share, the stranger on the street muttering threats, the experts arguing in tense tones. Harrington's words sounded different, measured, practiced, but carrying an edge of warning beneath the polish. "I can tell you this," Harrington continued. "If you decide to sell, we can guarantee you freedom from all this noise. Collectors will line up, governments will take notice, and we will secure you a sum that could provide comfort for the rest of your life. Millions, Eli. Enough to never worry again." He paused, letting the number hang in the air like a lure. "But understand this. If you keep it, you will not know peace. Its very existence will draw attention you cannot control. There are people who will not stop until they have it, by fair means or otherwise." Eli lowered his gaze to the coin, its faint engravings catching the light as though mocking him. He thought of his grandfather's letter, the words scrawled in shaky ink, meant to outlast all of us. Was selling a betrayal of that promise, or was it protection? He imagined a quiet life with no more laughter in classrooms, no more greedy faces at the door, no more strangers following him down streets. The temptation gnawed at him, sharper with every passing second. Professor Lowell broke the silence, his voice steady but gentle. It's his decision, no one else's. Harrington nodded, his eyes never leaving Eli. Of course, but decisions made young can echo for a lifetime. Think carefully, boy. Wealth can buy safety, but holding on to this coin might cost you more than you realize. Eli closed the lid of the box with trembling hands, the sound of it shutting echoing like finality. He rose slowly from his chair, clutching it to his chest. His voice was quiet, but clear enough to be heard. It was given to me. I'm not ready to let it go. The auctioneer's eyes softened, though his smile carried something unreadable. Very well, but remember my words, Eli. Every treasure has its price, and not all of it is paid in money. As Eli and Professor Lowell stepped back into the marble hall, the weight of the box seemed heavier than ever. The promise of wealth had been laid before him like a golden path, but so too had the warning of dangers that grew with every step he took. He held the coin closer, unsure if he had chosen courage or folly, but certain that his grandfather's legacy was still his to bear. The papers arrived on a gray morning, delivered by a man in a suit who looked as though he wished to be anywhere else. He handed them to the foster mother, who frowned at the heavy envelope before calling Eli down from his room. When Eli opened it, his heart sank. The bold lettering at the top spelled out what he barely understood. Notice of legal action. The words blurred as he scanned them, but the meaning slowly settled into place. His cousins, the same ones who had mocked him at the funeral and later stormed the foster home, demanding their share, were suing him. They claimed he was too young to hold responsibility for something so valuable. They wanted the court to appoint a guardian to oversee the coin on behalf of the family, which Eli knew meant they wanted for themselves. The foster parents read over the papers with expressions of discomfort. The foster father muttered about the trouble the coin was bringing, while the foster mother sighed and told Eli not to worry, though her eyes betrayed her unease. To Eli, the words on the page felt like shackles. It was not enough that strangers had followed him or that his relatives had shown up at the door demanding the coin. Now they had found a way to take it from him legally, to strip it from the wooden box where it belonged and place it in the hands of those who had never cared about it until it gleamed with fortune. Professor Lowell was the first person Eli turned to. They met in the quiet of the university office, the journal and box sitting between them on the desk. Lowell read the documents carefully, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. At last, he set them down and rubbed his temple. "They're clever," he said softly. "They're not claiming ownership directly. They're arguing that as a minor, you cannot legally safeguard or manage an artifact of such significance. It's a tactic meant to corner you." Eli's chest tightened. "Can they take it?" Lowell paused and answered carefully. "Not without a fight. The coin was given to you, and there is evidence of that. Your grandfather's letter, the journal, the provenance we've already traced. But the court may see things differently. They will claim you are vulnerable, incapable of deciding how to protect it." The days that followed were a blur of anxiety. Letters arrived from attorneys representing the cousins, filled with language Eli didn't understand but felt crushing all the same. At school, whispers grew louder. Some classmates asked if it was true he was getting sued. Others laughed, calling him a rich kid who couldn't even keep his own treasure. The weight of the box in his backpack grew heavier, not just from the coin, but from the fear that it might soon be taken from him by people who had mocked it as worthless. The first court hearing was held in a building that smelled of varnish and old paper. Eli sat at a long wooden table beside Professor Lowell, who had agreed to testify on his behalf, while across from him the cousins sat with sharp suits and sharper smiles. Their lawyer spoke in smooth tones about the best interests of the child, framing the coin as a burden Eli could not possibly carry. Eli wanted to shout that it was not a burden at all, that it was a promise, a legacy, a piece of his grandfather's hand still holding his. But his voice felt small in the cavernous room. When it was Lowell's turn, he rose and spoke with quiet authority. He explained the coin's significance, the evidence of Eli's family connection to the mint, the journal that tied the artifact directly to his ancestor's hand. He argued that Eli was not merely a boy with a coin, but the rightful custodian of an inheritance no one else had been entrusted with. The judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable. She announced that the matter would require further review, that custody of the coin would remain unsettled until more evidence was presented. Eli left the courtroom with his box still in his hands, but the relief was temporary. The fight was not over. It had only just begun. That night, sitting alone in his small room, Eli placed the coin on the dresser and stared at it under the weak glow of the lamp. The laughter of his cousins echoed in his memory, their mocking voices now sharpened into legal threats. He whispered his grandfather's words again, asterisk men outlast all of us asterisk, and felt the truth in them more than ever. The coin had survived fire, destruction, secrecy, and time itself. Now it had to survive greed dressed in the clothes of law. And Eli, no matter how young they said he was, would not let it go without a fight. The courtroom was colder than Eli expected, its high ceiling and stone walls making every sound echo as though magnified. Rows of benches filled quickly with people who had nothing to do with the case but wanted to see it unfold, their whispers rippling like waves whenever the heavy doors opened. At the front, the judge's bench loomed above them all, the flag draped at its side, and beneath it sat the long wooden tables where the two sides faced each other. Eli sat stiffly at one table, the wooden box before him, while across the aisle his cousins shifted impatiently in their tailored suits. Their lawyer leaned close to them, whispering with a confidence that made Eli's stomach twist. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The scrape of benches and shoes filled the room before silence settled again. The proceedings began with the lawyer for the cousins, who spoke in calm but pointed tones about Eli's age, his supposed inability to understand the value of what he held, and the danger of leaving such an extraordinary artifact in the hands of a child. He gestured often toward Eli, framing him not as a custodian of history, but as a boy playing with something too big for him. When it was their turn, Professor Lowell stood. His voice carried with quiet conviction as he described the research already conducted. The metal analysis, the faint initials of Charles Barber, the journal of John Turner connecting the family to the Philadelphia Mint. He explained that the coin was no accident, no bauble pulled from obscurity, but a piece of American history meant to survive. His words drew nods from some in the gallery, though the cousin's lawyer smirked as if it were all theatrics. At last, the judge requested to see the coin itself. Eli's chest tightened. He opened the wooden box slowly, lifting the coin with trembling fingers before setting it carefully on the velvet cloth prepared on the evidence table. For a moment, the room seemed to lean forward, every breath held as the coin caught the courtroom's light. Its worn surface glinted faintly, the faint markings along its rim almost invisible unless one knew to look for them. The judge leaned down, examining it closely before passing it to a court officer, who held it under a magnifier. Murmurs rose in the gallery as people craned their necks, straining for a glimpse of the object that had drawn so much attention. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras flashing each time the coin changed hands. The judge cleared her throat, restoring order, but the energy in the room had shifted. The coin was no longer a rumor whispered among experts. It was here undeniable, displayed under the solemn gaze of the law. Outside the courthouse, news crews had gathered. By the time recess was called, Eli stepped into a storm of microphones and shouted questions. How did you get it? Is it really the lost Barber pattern? Will you sell it? The voices collided, flashing bulbs blinding him as he clutched the box close against his chest. Professor Lowell guided him quickly through the throng, shielding him from the crush of reporters. That evening, the story appeared on national broadcasts. Anchors spoke of the boy with the impossible coin, showing images of the courtroom sketch, of Eli sitting small and silent at the table while the box lay before him. Commentators speculated on its worth, some saying $5 million, others more. Some questioned whether it belonged in private hands at all, while others marveled at the sheer improbability of its survival. Back in his room, Eli watched the news replay on the small television in the foster home. His foster siblings crowded around, wide-eyed, whispering about how rich he must be. The foster parents exchanged uneasy glances, as if unsure whether this fame was a blessing or a curse. But Eli ignored them all. He stared at the screen, at the image of the coin magnified larger than life, and felt a strange mix of fear and resolve. The courtroom had proven one thing beyond doubt. The coin could no longer hide in the shadows of his backpack. Its existence was now a matter of public record. debated in homes and universities, argued over by lawyers and historians alike. His grandfather's words echoed louder than ever. Asterisk men outlast all of us. Asterisk coin had survived destruction, secrecy, and time, and now it had survived into the blinding light of the present. Eli placed it back in the box and shut the lid with care. The noise of reporters, the jeers of relatives, the arguments of experts, they all seemed to swirl around him like a storm. But beneath it, steady as a heartbeat, lay the truth. The coin was just a guard, and no courtroom, no camera, no headline could take away the fact that it had found its way to him. The day the verdict came, the courtroom was more crowded than ever. The benches groaned under the weight of townspeople, collectors, and reporters, each craning to witness what had become less a trial and more a spectacle. The coin had already been examined by panels of experts, weighed and measured, scanned and scrutinized under microscopes. But now the final statement was to be read into the record, a decision that would ripple far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Eli sat quietly at the table beside Professor Lowell, the wooden box closed before him, his fingers resting on its smooth lid as if to draw strength from its grain. The lead appraiser took the stand, his suit immaculate, his tone careful. He spoke of metallurgy reports, of gold purity beyond standard circulation, of rim markings consistent with Charles Barber's experimental engravings. He described the initials faintly inscribed along the edge, the same initials found in historical records of trial pieces that had supposedly been destroyed in 1887. He even held up enlarged photographs, displaying details that most eyes in the room had never noticed. The subtle shift in the eagle's feathers, the minute variance in the spacing of stars. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. Then came the words that would change everything. "It is the opinion of this panel," he said, "that the coin presented here is authentic. It is a Barber pattern $5 piece, struck in the early 1880s, one of perhaps 2 or 3 ever produced. Given its provenance, condition, and extraordinary rarity, we estimate its value to be in excess of $7 million. The number hung in the air like thunder. Gasps spread to the gallery. Reporters' pens flying. Cameras flashing as though trying to catch the coin's glow through sheer insistence. Eli's cousins shifted uneasily at their table, their faces drained of the smug certainty they had worn for weeks. The judge banged her gavel for order, but the excitement could not be silenced so easily. Eli sat still, staring down at the box as though the coin inside might suddenly vanish. $7 million. It was more than he could even imagine, more than the Foster family's house, more than anything he had ever dreamed of. But the number didn't feel real. What felt real was the weight of his grandfather's shaky handwriting on the letter tucked inside the box, the words that had guided him through ridicule and fear, meant to outlast all of us. When the gavel struck again, the judge made it clear the coin would remain Eli's property. The lawsuit from the cousins was dismissed, their claim of guardianship rejected. The court recognized the coin as his legal inheritance, entrusted directly by his grandfather. The relatives rose in protest, muttering threats of appeal, but the judge silenced them with a firm command. For the first time since the funeral, Eli felt the world acknowledge what his grandfather had already known. The coin was his, and no one else's. Outside the courthouse, the air was electric. Reporters crowded the steps, their microphones thrust forward, shouting questions about what he would do with the fortune, whether he would sell, whether he would donate it to a museum. Professor Lowell shielded him as best he could, guiding him through the chaos. But Eli noticed something strange in himself. He wasn't tempted by the talk of millions. He thought, instead of the library's dim light, of Mrs. Whitaker's patient guidance, of the attic where he had found the journal, and of the long line of hands that had carried the coin across generations. That night, back in his room, Eli set the box on the dresser and opened it carefully. The coin lay still, its dull shine unchanged, indifferent to the frenzy it had caused. He picked it up, feeling its familiar weight in his palm, heavier now not because of the gold, but because of everything it represented. To others, it was $7 million. To him, it was history, family, and trust. He whispered the words one more time, letting them steady him, meant to outlast all of us, and now he understood the value was not just in money, it was in survival, in the fact that this coin had defied destruction, greed, and time itself to rest in his hand. $7 million was what the world saw. What he saw was a legacy that no price could buy. The days after the verdict blurred together in a whirlwind of letters, phone calls, and visits. The court's confirmation and the $7 million valuation had unleashed a storm Eli could hardly comprehend. Collectors from across the country sent proposals, some typed neatly on letterhead, others scribbled in hurried ink, all promising fortunes. Museums drafted formal requests, their directors writing a preservation and public trust, urging that the coin belong behind glass where the world could see it. Investors appeared too, men in press suits who spoke not of history, but of opportunities, of turning one artifact into a fortune that would multiply. Each offer promised security, and each came with its own kind of pressure. The foster parents, who had once dismissed the coin as trouble, now hovered at his door, suggesting how useful the money could be. They spoke of college, of new beginnings, of freedom from a system that never seemed to care for boys like him. Even his classmates, who had once laughed at the trinket, now whispered around him in awe, some asking if he might buy them things, others watching him with a wariness reserved for someone suddenly set apart. Eli felt pulled in every direction, yet in the quiet of his small room, the noise fell away. He would open the box at night, holding the coin in his palm, its surface still dull and worn, unchanged by the chaos it had stirred. To him, it did not look like millions. It looked like his grandfather's trembling handwriting, like the faded ink of a ledger, like the faint initials carved along its rim that told a story no one else had believed. Professor Lowell advised caution. They met often, sitting together in the hushed library or his office crowded with books. If you sell, Lowell said one afternoon, you'll have stability, no question. You could set yourself up for life, escape the hardships you've endured. But if you preserve it, if you hold on to it, you safeguard something no one else can, a legacy not measured in money but in endurance. He paused, watching Eli closely. This is not an easy choice, and it's not one anyone should make for you. Eli thought of Mrs. Whitaker, too, her gentle reminder that some truths take time to uncover. She had never once urged him to sell, only to keep looking, to keep learning. In her eyes, the coin was not a prize, but a page in a story still being written. The museum's offer lingered in his thoughts most heavily. The idea of placing it behind glass, where children and scholars alike could see it, felt noble. Yet something in him recoiled at the thought of giving it up, of losing the small, heavy comfort of carrying it in his pocket, the quiet ritual of tapping it 3 times before school, the whispered promise each night before bed. He remembered the faces of his cousins, sneering and grasping, their words sharp with greed. He remembered the stranger who had followed him down a dark street, demanding he hand it over. To them, the coin was only wealth. But to him, it was different. It was a link across generations, a reminder that even a boy mocked and dismissed could hold something that mattered, something meant to outlast ridicule and fear. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted a small room in amber light, Eli made his decision. He placed the coin back in the box and closed the lid with deliberate care. He would not sell, not now, not for millions, not for promises of safety or wealth. To sell it would be to reduce it to a number, to strip away the meaning his grandfather had left in his trembling script. Instead, he resolved to preserve it, not locked away forever, nor flaunted in public auctions, but safeguarded as it had always been, through quiet hands that understood its weight. Someday, perhaps, it would find its place in a museum or a collection, but not until it had grown into the man his grandfather believed he could become. For now, it remained his. Not just a coin, but a legacy, a reminder and a promise still unfolding. As the last light faded, Eli whispered the words once more into silence, meant to outlast all of us, and he knew, with a certainty deeper than any verdict or valuation, that his choice honored not just the coin, but the family and history it carried within its gold. The journal had sat on Eli's dresser for weeks, its leather cracked and its pages fragile, yet he had never read it all the way through. He had studied the early entries, the notes about the mint, the quiet mentions of barber and the mysterious patterned coins. Those pages had given him proof, a history that justified the coin's existence and silenced the laughter of those who mocked him. But there were later pages he had avoided, perhaps out of fear of what they might say. Now, In the quiet after the storm of lawsuits, valuations, and offers, he felt ready to turn to the very end. The house was still, the foster parents asleep, the other children long gone to bed. A small lamp on his nightstand cast a warm circle of light across the worn journal. Eli turned the pages slowly, the scent of old ink and dust rising faintly with each movement. The handwriting grew shakier as the entries went on, the careful strokes of the earlier years giving way to lines that slanted with age. At last, he reached the final page. It was dated only a few months before his grandfather's death. The words stretched across the page in a hand that trembled but still carried purpose. Eli read them silently at first, then aloud in a whisper, as if his grandfather's voice could be summoned from the ink. "If anyone finds these words," the entry began, "I want them to know that this coin was never meant to bring fortune. It was meant to remind. Remind us that history is fragile, that memory is the only thing that truly survives. I have lived a long life with little money and fewer comforts, but I have never felt poor because I carry with me this link to those who came before. I ask whoever holds it next, do not chase wealth from it. Let it keep our story alive." Eli paused, his throat tightening. He blinked hard, forcing himself to keep reading. "You may be tempted," the writing continued, "to see only the shine of gold. Others will tell you it is worth millions. But remember, value is not always money. Value is the breath of a name spoken after one is gone, the memory of hands that shaped the world quietly, without recognition. This coin is the proof that we existed, that we mattered in the long stretch of time. Guard it, not for wealth, but for remembrance." The words blurred as tears filled Eli's eyes. He closed the journal for a moment, pressing it against his chest. The noise of the world, the auctioneer's polished voice, the lawyer's threats, the reporter's endless questions, seemed to fade away. What remained was his grandfather's steady, unshakable truth. The coin had never been meant as a treasure chest of riches. It was a marker, a story, a whisper of family that had touched history and survived through memory. Eli opened the journal again and ran his fingers over the ink, tracing the letters as though he could feel the old man's hand guiding his own. He thought of the wooden box, the letter hidden in its false bottom, the faint initials carved along the rim of the coin. All of it pointed not to wealth but to continuity, to a grandfather who wanted to be remembered, and ancestors who had worked in the mint long before anyone thought their labor mattered. For the first time, Eli felt at peace with his decision not to sell. The millions promised by collectors or auction houses seemed small compared to the weight of those final words. He would carry the coin not as currency, but as memory. He would keep it not locked away forever, but alive in the telling of the story, in the knowledge that remembrance had always been the truest inheritance. He closed the journal gently, setting it beside the box on the dresser. The lamp flickered, and in the quiet, Eli whispered into the still air, "I remember Grandpa." The words lingered soft but certain, and for the first time since the funeral, he felt that his grandfather's wish had been fulfilled. It began slowly, almost reluctantly, as if the town itself was embarrassed to admit how wrong it had been. For months, Eli had walked the streets with his head lowered, the weight of the wooden box heavy in his backpack, and the sting of laughter heavier still in his memory. Children had mocked him in classrooms, adults had dismissed him as a boy clinging to scraps, and even his foster family had shaken their heads at what they called his obsession. But now, after the court had spoken, after experts had confirmed the coin's existence and value, the whispers in town changed their shape. At first, people stared at him differently. Shopkeepers who once ignored him now greeted him with polite nods. Teachers who had once sighed at his presentations now spoke his name with a quiet respect. Even classmates who had laughed the loudest fell silent when he passed. One of them, a boy who called it a rusty trinket, stopped in the hallway one morning and muttered an awkward apology, his eyes not quite meeting Eli's. It was small, but it was something. Soon, the story spread beyond the schoolyard. The local paper ran a front-page article with his picture beside the coin, the headline calling it "The Treasure That Shouldn't Exist." Reporters visited the town, speaking to people who had known his grandfather, gathering fragments of stories about a quiet man who had lived modestly, never speaking of the history he carried. The same townsfolk who had once dismissed him now claimed to remember details, adding their voices to the growing narrative that Eli was not simply lucky, but chosen. At the library, where it had all begun, Mrs. Whitaker watched with her usual calm as groups of students now asked to see the catalogs Eli had once studied alone. Some even asked him questions, treating him like someone who had something worth teaching. He answered as best he could, awkward but steady, always remembering how different it had been when his classmates jeered. The irony was not lost on him, but he did not linger in bitterness. His grandfather's words echoed too clearly. Remembrance mattered more than ridicule. The town council even invited him to a small ceremony at the Historical Society, a gesture meant as both apology and celebration. He stood before the gathered crowd, the wooden box resting on a table beside him, and spoke in a voice quieter than the microphones expected. He did not talk about millions or auctions, but about legacy, about how the coin had survived because it was carried by people who valued memory over wealth. His words were simple, but when he finished, the applause filled the old hall in a way that left his chest tight. Walking home afterward, Eli noticed something had shifted. The town that once turned its back on him now seemed to open its doors. The diner owner offered him a free meal. Neighbors waved as he passed. For the first time, he did not feel like the boy with nothing. He felt like the boy who had held on when everyone else had let go. The respect did not erase the past. He still remembered the sting of every cruel word, every sneer at the funeral, every time someone urged him to sell the coin for candy money. But those memories no longer burned. They steadied him. They reminded him of what perseverance looked like, of how even a mocked boy could stand at the center of history. That evening, as he sat in his room with the box open, the coin resting in his palm, Eli thought about how strange it was that such a small object could change so much. The town had once laughed at him, but now they looked at both differently. Not because the coin was gold, not even because it was rare, but because it had endured, and he had endured with it. And in that endurance lay respect that no jeer could ever undo. The decision did not come quickly, nor was it easy. For weeks after court's verdict and the town's sudden respect, Eli lived in a haze of attention. Letters continued to arrive, collectors waving offers that grew larger by the day, museums drafting proposals with promises of prestige. He carried the box everywhere still, the weight of it against his chest a constant reminder of both burden and belonging. At night, when the house finally quieted, he would open it carefully, touch the worn coin, and read his grandfather's letter once more. Each time, the same words rose from the shaky handwriting, meant to outlast all of us, and each time, Eli felt the meaning pressed deeper into him. It was not the money that mattered. The experts had placed a price on the coin, but the journal had stripped that illusion away. His grandfather's last wish was not fortune. It was remembrance. The coin was proof of endurance, but the letter and the box were proof of love, of a family's quiet persistence through time. The more he thought about it, the more he understood that the coin, for all its rarity, belonged not to him but to history itself. What belonged to him were the things no auctioneer could price: the wooden box that had sheltered it, and the words written in fading ink that tied him to generations he had never known. So the boy who once clutched the box against his chest in fear made his way, weeks later, to the grand marble steps of the National Museum. Professor Lowell walked beside him, offering neither pressure nor persuasion, only steady presence. Inside, curators waited with careful reverence, white gloves at the ready, display cases already prepared. Reporters lingered too, though at a respectful distance, their cameras lowered until the moment arrived. Eli stood before them all, small in size yet steady in bearing, and opened the box one last time. He lifted the coin into the light. It looked the same as it always had, worn, dull in places, its engravings faint with age. But to the room, it glowed as if it carried its own fire. With quiet hands, Eli placed it into the waiting gloves of the curator. For the first time, he let it leave his possession, not to be taken or threatened or mocked, but to be preserved in a place where the world could see it, where it could teach long after he was gone. The cameras flashed, but Eli barely noticed. His gaze remained fixed on the curator's careful steps, the coin now cradled like fragile truth as it was carried toward its new home. There, behind glass, it would no longer be just a rumor or a story passed in whispers. It would be a fact of history, untouchable and undeniable. When the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, Eli walked out into the cool air of the city. The box was still with him, lighter now without the coin, but filled with something greater. Inside lay the folded letter, the ink of his grandfather's hand, the quiet wish that remembrance would triumph over wealth. Eli pressed it to his chest and felt, for the first time, a weight not of gold but of identity. He was no longer the boy mocked for a worthless trinket. He was the heir to a story that crossed centuries, a story of survival, trust, and dignity. The coin was gone from his keeping, but its legacy lived in him, carried forward with each step. The wooden box and the letter were enough. They were more than enough. They were his true inheritance. And as the sun dipped low over the city's skyline, Eli whispered into the evening air, "I remember." In that moment, he knew the gift his grandfather had left him was not a coin at all, but a way to belong, to himself, to his family, to history. The gold would rest in glass, but the legacy would live in him.